Hello and welcome to this series on Tantra Yoga Beginnings. I'm Steve and this is Steve White Yoga. This is a series of 3 sessions developed to introduce the ancient practices from India that go under the name of Tantra, transformative practices that can help frame life, create meaning, determine value, and often answer questions. If you want the basics of Tantra Yoga, you can look at the video that's linked up here in the description, which sort of gives a fundamental explanation. And if you're ready to go, join me now for this first 3 sessions on Tantra Yoga Beginnings. So thanks for joining and for your time and your interest in this really fascinating and compelling area of the yoga world called Tantra. It pervades not just yoga, but there's Buddhist Tantra, there's Taoist Tantra, and there are a couple of other spiritual sects in the Trans-Himalayan region that have some form of Tantra. And there are some similarities across the board, and I've had exposure to a couple of them, different versions of them, if you will. But I want to talk for just a minute about, very briefly, what Tantra is and what Tantra is not, at least as we're discussing it here. So this is a tradition that was practiced from roughly the 5th century through the 15th century in India. And it is predominantly a spiritual practice and available to almost anybody. You didn't necessarily have to be a Hindu or affiliated with any religion in order to be introduced to this community. And in fact, contrary to a lot of the earlier forms of yoga, this was open to anybody regardless of their class, their economic status, their sex, and their affiliation or non-affiliation with any other spiritual tradition. So it sort of opened the gates for what they would call in the tradition the householder to be able to engage in these practices. So this is an oral tradition. It was typically taught from student to student from guru or a spiritual teacher. And there are a bunch of different branches of Tantra, some of which didn't survive very much or very well into the modern day, and some of which survived pretty much intact, although at some point by 1500 or so, a lot of Tantra had disappeared or gone underground. And so I understand, I've never been to India, but today, if you go to India and look for, kind of Tantra as it was practiced many centuries ago, it's fairly difficult to find. It's a fairly exclusive club. And so that's sort of what Tantra is in India, or as it came from India. And then there's what we find in the modern Western world, and even the modern Indian world, frankly, which is stuff that's called Tantra, but doesn't have very much to do with the tradition, and is largely based on principles that were developed in New Age religion, which it's an interesting history we can't go through now, but they borrowed a lot of the signs and symbols and terminology, but it doesn't really reflect what was being done back in the day in India. And so it upsets people sometimes when I say this, but it's the truth, I swear. It's been historically verified that most anybody in this country, at least, who has heard about Tantra, been exposed to Tantra, is probably getting something that is at least greatly modified from the traditions practiced in India, or may have very little or almost nothing to do with it at all, except for some names. And so this is the fact of life. And what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of sessions is based on the original Tantra. As I often say to people, most of us aren't Indians, at least in this country, or a lot of us aren't Indians. And even those that are, aren't kind of medieval Indians. And so we don't have the reference points anyway to be practicing those original practices. And so some modification is going to be appropriate just for it to be understood, useful, accepted to a modern audience. And so that's what we'll endeavor to do here. Um, the way this will be set up is I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about um, a particular topic, and in this case, sort of why Tantra is relevant to today. And then we'll spend a few minutes in practice. So it's only a half hour, 30-minute session or so. And if we do have any time before we get cut out, I will welcome any questions or comments if anybody has any. So with all of that said, let's do a little bit of exploration. This is me, and we don't need to talk about me for very much, but just know that I'm a yoga teacher. I teach public classes, vinyasa style classes, beginners yoga, meditation classes, and a particular style called Vini Yoga, which incorporates an integration of a lot of different elements of traditional yoga practice, including some tantric practices. And I also am a certified yoga therapist, so I work with people on an individual basis. I do some workshops. I've participated in some teacher trainings. And most above all, really, I am a continued explorer of myself and my relationship with the world through these practices that are yogic in general, and these days, tantric more specifically. So that's what I am. And just to be clear, what I'm not is I'm not a guru. I'm not a spiritual teacher, and I'm not representing myself as one. So in the tradition, especially in the tradition of Tantra, but really throughout these medieval and ancient yoga traditions, a lot of people who were students and who learned this stuff and practiced this stuff were not sort of tapped to teach it. And so it's called, the English word is authorization. You're authorized to teach this stuff. And I am clearly not that, and I'm not in a position to, and I don't even necessarily endeavor to be a spiritual teacher. I'm a yoga teacher who knows something about this stuff and enough to be able to expose people to it in a way that is safe and hopefully meaningful. So that's me. Now, let's just talk about some of the basic principles of tantric science. And it is a science because it is a methodology. It's a methodic approach to dealing with issues of body, mind, and spirit would be one way to put it. And so these are some of the sort of common starting points from which most of the tantric branches developed in India started to arise. And the first thing that they recognized for a long time in India, going way back into ancient India, is that our natural or sort of regular experience of our lives, of the world, is from a place of what are translated as identification and attachment. So we have an ego, we have a self-concept, and we have things that we tend to be propelled toward and things that we tend to be averse to or propelled away from in life. And in this view, these are the motivating, the driving forces which establish a relationship first and foremost with ourselves, and then with our families, our friends, our communities, our work life, and in a much greater sense, our relationship with what could be called spirit, or our source, or consciousness is a word that's commonly used in the tantric world. So all of these relationships are not just influenced, but are essentially set in place by our self-concept and by our identification with the world. So then the purpose, as Tantra Yoga set out, was to seek to unearth and examine habitual patterns that are associated with our own self-concept and with our attachments and our aversions. And then to further examine sort of the forces that are at play that propel us to either be attracted to something or to be inhibited in terms of how we behave in the world. And if maybe you've had experience with this stuff before and some exposure to it, and you may even have your own meditative practice that you've done, one of the things that one realizes through almost any meditative tradition is that the way that we work in normal life is that there are certain things we want to do and there are certain things we don't want to do. And some of them we do anyway because we feel some compulsion to do them. We feel obligated. We feel that, you know, it's part of our job or part of our family or community obligation or whatever it might be. And then there are certain things that we avoid or that we criticize. And almost everything that goes on in daily life is reflected in that. And so what we're really looking for through these tantric practices is the forces behind them. There's a word, it's an English word, and it isn't used very often. The word is conative. It's C-O-N-A-T-I-V-E, conative. And it means impulse. So the question, one of the questions that the tantrics asked was, what is the impulse that is driving these attachments and these aversions? And certainly one of them is the desire to live, or the desire not to die, the aversion to death. Survival is a common one, but beyond that, how do we see ourselves? How do others people see us? And these kind of impulses are those that tend to drive our behaviors and to create what they would say in the tradition are habitual behavior patterns that we don't tend to step out of very much or very often once they're established, unless we make a conscious effort to do so. So through creating a different relationship to our own habitual patterns, we can develop greater clarity about who we really are and what is most important to our lives. So this is a really interesting and almost a magical process where over time, through practice, as we start to uncover these patterns, examine them, and then off the cushion, start to recognize how they play out in our own lives, it actually creates behavioral modifications. And so we start to see the world differently. Our perspective changes. What's most important and precious to us becomes different. And the whole orientation, both to ourselves and to the world around us, begins to shift over time. And in that respect, we can come to better conclusions about what's right or wrong for us, or best or not best for us, what's most healthy, what's most functional, and start to eliminate those items, those behaviors, those things in our lives that all of a sudden or through time don't seem to be so crucial. So this is part of the process of Tantra. So through a regular concerted effort, that is a practice, we can access our highest potential and live in greater balance and harmony with both ourselves and with our world. So this becomes one of the primary goals of the practice of Tantrikas, is to achieve a better relationship with ourselves, a fuller, more complete relationship with the world, to understand what our place is in the world and what is most important for us to do, to accomplish, and ultimately to have some realization of what we might say is the true self, or consciousness, that which connects us to everyone and everything else. And it's called by, or spoken of by various names. It's called not awareness. It's called realization. It's called awakening. Some people call it nirvana. So it isn't necessarily a place that we go to, and it isn't necessarily a higher state that we reside in, but it's an understanding. It's a conceptual realization that we're all part of one great big thing, one great big churning energy, if you want to think of it that way. And so that's one of the primary goals of Tantra, to get to that point. All right. So let's talk a little bit about practice before we get into it. And there are a couple of things that I would just mention as we practice. Now, these are fairly simple practices to begin with, at least in the first 3 of this series. And so focus is obviously important, which suggests that to the extent possible, any obstructions to focus, to attention, be removed. So the obvious one there is anything that's connected to the internet or to a cell tower, excuse me. And to the extent it's possible, people, animals, events that are around you be removed in order to have an effective practice. Because your practice is constantly being interrupted, even if it's because you put your phone on vibrate and the phone vibrates, it draws our attention away. And you can't have an effective practice if there's a constant sort of deflection of attention to being in the current moment. So having a space that you can call your own, even if it's only for the time of a practice, is incredibly helpful. So it could be a corner, or it could be a closet, or it could be a bathroom. If it's someplace that you can get away from whatever it is that lives in your household or is around in your life, that you can call your own, and to the best you can to call off the distractions and tell them that you're not available for the term of practice, that's incredibly helpful as well. And then for practice itself, really a practice should be daily. It doesn't have to be long necessarily. 10, 20 minutes can make a very effective practice. But the discipline of having a daily practice, along with the effects of doing something over and over and over, repeated regularly over a period of time, really makes this stuff work. And then you may have heard the expression, if you're at all involved in the spiritual world, Zen mind, beginner's mind. And what that means is that no matter how many times before you may have done something similar to this, or done this kind of a practice that we're going to do tonight or in the ensuing weeks, have the humility to look at it as new. There are people, and I've worked with some of them, who are like, I've done those practices for years, and I'm sure that I've gotten everything out of them. And frankly, that's called spiritual snobbery. So we're trying to look at this as a fresh experience. I've been doing meditative practices for over 20 years, and I still go back to some of the first that I ever learned and revisit them. And there's always the possibility of unearthing something new, even with the simplest of practices that you may have done before. So with that all said, we're going to do a little practice. Now, if you're expecting to move around on a mat, I apologize, because certainly what's called asana in the yoga world, or movement, or posture practice, can be part of a tantric practice. And in fact, in a longer practice would be, but because our time is limited, and because really the most important part of this is the seated meditation part, that's the part that I've chosen to focus on for this first series. And I teach classes where I do other things, and we do a fuller practice that includes some movement and some breath work and some chanting. But that's beyond the scope of what we're doing, just starting out. So with that all in mind, I would invite you to find a seated position that's comfortable for you. And if that's on a piece of furniture, that's fine, but we like the spine to support itself. So no chair backs, no walls, feeling fully supported as much as you can. And there is no extra credit for sitting on the floor or on a cushion. So if that's not comfortable for you, it's priority to be comfortable. So as you close your eyes, just have a sense of your body. Have a sense of the position of your body and its shape. Allow your head to float on the top of your spine. Soften your face. Relax your jaw. Feel your eyes relax. Let your whole scalp soften. And then bring your attention to your breath, and without manipulating or changing anything, pick a point where you experience the breath. So it might be at the nostrils or through the nose. It might be in your throat, your chest, your belly. It doesn't matter which, but settle on one place where you can experience the breath. And draw your awareness into that place as best you can. So this is a really simple practice. It's called by different names. One of them is the two-pot breath, and it's a really simple way of thinking about the rib cage as being one pot and the abdominal area being a second pot. So two separate pots. So with that, would you begin to deepen your inhale, lengthen your exhale through a couple of breath cycles? And we're just looking for a full expression of the breath without straining anything. And as you deepen your inhale, let your low belly accept that deepening breath. And then allow your chest to fill once the belly has filled. And then relax your belly and relax your chest. So this is the practice, inhaling, feeling the belly expand till it's comfortably full, and then opening the chest. Exhaling, allowing the chest to empty, allowing the belly to empty. This is a process called dharana in the yoga world. It means concentration. So we're bringing focus to rest, in this case, on a particular event. Belly to chest, inhale. Chest to belly, exhale. As we're all subject to the condition of a wandering mind, if your mind moves and goes somewhere else, just gently draw it back. So there are two parts to this process, really. The first is to notice that the mind wanders, bring it back to the path, bring it back to the instruction. And the second part is just to relax your attention as best you can into this simple process. Continue to take full advantage of your natural capacity to inhale and exhale without strain. Each breath becomes a new experience as if it's coming up for the first time. People who are newer to meditation will tend to come up with questions in their mind like, am I doing this right? Or is this all there is to it? Or I can't do this, or this is so easy, or I'm so good at this. In Buddhism, they say the path is the goal. So it isn't about what you accomplish or achieve. It's about participating in the process and nothing else. Sometimes the thought that comes up is, this is boring. And like any other thought, it's something to be worked through and beyond in this practice. So whatever comes up in your mind, the only value it has is that it's some thought. Bring your awareness back to filling pots and emptying them. So keep your attention focused internally for a moment. This is a good beginning practice, or even one to incorporate into an existing practice. If you already have one, 10 minutes of this simple practice. 20 minutes is always ideal if you can find it. And it's always encouraged to pick a time of day and stick to that time of day if it's possible in your world. But this is a practice that sort of creates the first stepping stone in this path of tantric yoga. And we build through weeks and months of further refining attention. Small changes start to take place. You notice first on the mat, and then they tend to translate and carry it around with us in life too. It can be varied depending on the practitioner, but the changes do take place. It's part of the guarantee of the path. So, with that, I will take my hands together and wish you all Om. I hope you're finding value in this series, and if you are, please feel free to subscribe by hitting the button below. And if you can give me a like, that's always really helpful for the channel. Please join me for future videos and for other sessions of Yoga Beyond the Mat to manage your health, improve your relationships, and balance your life. Until next time, my name is Steve. This is Steve White Yoga. Om.